got all of this information being stored, a lot of data being shared, obviously all sort of linked using a range of different devices. There is a risk in terms of cyber attacks on networks or leakage of information. Damien, I don't know whether you can comment a little bit on how you'd be able to identify an attack on heat network infrastructure, and some of the risks or controls that you might expect to see.
Yeah, I think before you can identify attack, you really do need to almost take a step back. So, you know, we can talk about monitoring our networks, you know, the computer networks, monitoring our devices, but you need to almost take a step back from that and say, what's our holistic approach to security, rather than let's try and whack-a-mole fix problems as they arise. You know, we're seeing something happening over here that doesn't look good. Let's go fix it. We need to really actually think, you know, what security frameworks can we put in place? What frameworks should we be implementing as an organization in order to, you know, take that, as I say, holistic approach. And in terms of the heat networks, we're likely to see as part of the regulation, similar to what we have currently in electricity and gas regulation and the smart energy codes, where there's a reliance on organizations to have particular certificates and accreditations to operate in those markets and work and be licensed against those codes. So, you know, we're likely to see similar regulation coming in, particularly once Ofgem take over. So it's probably worth spending a minute just talking about a couple of those frameworks, I guess, that you know you might need to comply with. At a basic level in the UK, we have the Cyber Essentials framework, which is really sort of kind of a top-down view. Okay, we've got our systems in place. How do we go about protecting them? And it talks about a number of controls. Okay, you've got your system set up. You've already got things in place. You've got your databases. You know, you've got your networks already set up. How do we go about protecting these things you've got now? You know, what patching are you doing on these systems? What firewalls have you got installed? What configurations have you got? And the other alternative to that is more around the NIST framework, which is more looking at doing things in a process where you identify. I mean, there's effectively 5 stages to this, where you identify your risk, you then protect, you detect, you respond, and you recover. And that really, you know, starts at the ground and says, okay, what assets have we got within our estate that we need to identify? You know, which ones are we most at risk from? Which ones have potentially the biggest impact if these were compromised? Let's identify these things, and then we can start ranking them and say, okay, you know, this has got a high priority, high risk. We need to, you know, do something about this one in particular. Which then, when you come to your protect phase, you can then use these to identify and say, okay, these are the things we need to protect. You know, this database over here, these sensors over there, and we can start talking then about the controls we put in place, right? How do we go about protecting these critical things? And then finally, you get to that stage where you're talking about monitoring. What are we doing to detect? Now we've got these things in place. We know what our assets are. We know we've got the control there. How are we now identifying that we're under attack? Someone is, you know, it's a vulnerability. Someone is trying to attack our system through one of these assets we've identified, potentially against an asset we haven't identified, but that comes back into the, you know, you're under attack, and then you need to recover from that. So there's a phase there as well around recovery and getting back to your sort of business as usual. Hopefully you've got a disaster recovery plan in place. If you are unfortunate enough to have an attack following a vulnerability, there'll be lessons learned from that, and that feeds back into your cycle for your back to identify you've got a new area, a new asset you might not have recognized before. So we identify that. So yeah, that's one or all of these frameworks are useful. One might be more relevant depending on where you are in terms of the heat networks, which part you operate, where you sit, whether you're getting customer data or whether you're actually operating the network. So yeah, I think having a framework is the key for this, Sam.
Great, thanks, Damien. Did anyone else want to come in?
Yeah, so I'll jump in there for a sec, Sam. So we've been through both the Cyber Essentials and ISO 27001. Cyber Essentials is pretty specific for, it's kind of a generic ops sort of thing where you're testing laptops and desktops and office networks and sort of for securing an office. Really good for hygiene for that kind of thing. But when we get into infrastructure, and Damien, I think this is what you were already strongly implying. You've got to then apply the framework to your system, and you've got to decide through something like a statement of applicability. You got to say this is what's in and this is what's out. So it requires you as part of a utility system to kind of draw lines around the bit where you're going to apply it, and then to apply the framework to identify risks, decide what's going to be treated, what's not going to be treated, which controls are going to be in place, what are you going to accept, because the threat level it directly relates to cost, right? So you've got to decide what's the threat level that is appropriate for you to mitigate against, and that could be anything from cyber kiddies to a state level actor, right? This is one of the really interesting aspects of heat networks, because we've kind of been a niche area of the energy system, right? We've been growing, and it's growing even faster than it ever has. There's this expectation that something like 20, as you were saying, Sam, 20% of UK heat is going to be delivered over heat networks by 2050, if not before. That certainly ceases to be niche. And at that point, you are an attractive target for maybe even state level actors, but certainly well-funded actors who want to bring down critical infrastructure. Heating and cooling is definitely critical infrastructure. So the levels of threat, I think, are likely to evolve as heat networks become a more and more significant part of the UK energy system.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely an evolving picture, and will continue to change as we move forward. So yeah, moving on to another theme. I know there were some comments in the chat, but we will come back to some of those. In terms of the issues associated with data sharing, particularly with third parties, what sort of challenges, and maybe Casey, one for you again, sorry, but what are the sort of challenges that you see in terms of trying to share data with lots of different actors? Like a lot of heat networks, the local authority is involved, you've got the operator, you've potentially got a housing association that's connected, new build developments. How do you go about sharing that data, and what are some of the issues?
Okay, so the thing that most heavily influences how you might be sharing data is whether it's personal data, right? Whether there's a human being involved. We know that once let's say a flat is occupied on a heat network and the heat meter is collecting information, that data is personal data under GDPR. Before somebody moves into that flat, there isn't a human being associated with it, and the controls that are applied to it would be set appropriately. The challenge during project execution is less than the challenge once a heat network has got customers on it. But that thing that I was describing before, where you've got a bunch of data, potentially detailed data, and potentially, we were talking about, there's been some chat going on about, is it 15-minutely? Should it be more than 15-minutely? In any case, this is fine-grained data, and there's a lot of information in there, right? So it has to be handled really carefully. But we've got legitimate stakeholders who need to access that data in order to do their jobs. Everybody from the regulator potentially down to the operation and maintenance contractor. So the data ownership starts with the resident. It starts with the customer on the heat network. They have a relationship to their heat supplier, and ideally what needs to happen is that relationship needs to explicitly address in an agreement how that data is going to get used. Okay, and then from there, that data then might go off to different stakeholders, but always you would expect in the interests of operating that heat network better. I think GDPR 2018, GDPR? In 2018, we watched different parts of the European market, the heat network market, react differently to this issue that I'm describing about how does that personal data get used in order to improve, how can it be shared? And two extremes on that spectrum would be the Danish Energy Association, who put out guidance saying that this data is totally necessary in order to optimize the heat network itself, and therefore it is legitimate. It is a legitimate use of that data for that purpose. The other end of the spectrum is, you could argue, something like someplace like Germany, where by default all that data is locked down, and you have to get explicit approval from the individual in the dwelling where that data is coming from before it can be used for any purpose. I think in the UK we are more like Denmark so far than like Germany. Having lived through quite a few heat network optimizations using data, I'm absolutely confident that that data is necessary in order for that work to be carried out. And what I would hate to see happen is if we were to get that balance wrong, that balance between privacy and shareability with the need to operate these systems well, because in the absence of that data, at least in this market, those networks will not operate well. So it's a tough challenge. It starts with the contractual relationship between the resident or the customer and the heat network operator. And that has to be a robust enough agreement that that data can be used by the stakeholders for the purposes that that are strictly necessary for the efficient operating of that network. And that has to be, I think all that is necessary in order for this 20% figure to get hit.
Kaveh, did you want to come in at all on the
Sure.
privacy point?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Casey said. I think it's an interesting case in point. I think the first place I would start is the degree of data sharing and the degree of even collection, to which is permissible, would depend on the type of data, right? There's data that's needed for performance reasons, as Casey mentioned and has been mentioned in the chat, that should be treated differently to personal data. If it's what's personal in a heat network, is going to be data that's able to identify an individual premise. So if it's able to, even consumption data, metadata will only be personal if it's able to be linked to an individual premise or an individual residence. That's what was the case in electricity and gas, and it's the case in water. So obviously, if there's information that's available at an aggregate level or from sensors in the network or across multiple premises that doesn't need to be individualized or doesn't need to be stored in an individual level or shared at an individual level, then it shouldn't be. The second level is really about I think, as Casey alluded to as well, about the legal basis. So if you're required under a license obligation to report on performance data as a heat network operator, then you've got a legal obligation, which is a GDPR legal basis, to collect and share that data. If it's if just thinking of some other potential situations, it's needed for the police or law enforcement may want to investigate energy theft or tampering with heat interface units, then there's another potential legal basis for sharing that data if you're a heat network operator or an organization that is presented with a warrant or something similar. Otherwise, and also for meeting and billing, there's either a contractual basis with the consumer or a legal basis for collecting and sharing that data. For anything else, is probably where consent is going to be needed. Anything else, consumer insights. We may see more in the future the development of applications that will allow more efficient use of energy, or that will allow the connections to look at how hot waters are being used by different by boilers, by radiators, by different applications that will generally need consent. But I don't think we're at that stage yet. So yeah, I think it remains to be seen how the rules evolve. Right now, there's very limited rules on sharing personal data in the energy industry, and in the heat network industry, and currently we're relying on GDPR and best practice. I'd say that's probably the chief considerations for collecting and sharing the personal elements of data.
Great, thank you. And just touching on we've spoken a bit about identifying problems and improving efficiency in collecting data for that purpose. But the last point here is around supporting priority services, and I guess it's identifying problems as well, but identifying those individuals that need access to heating and need to see their heating returned as quickly as possible. Kaveh, I don't know, again, do you want to take that one, touching on sort of some of the Ofgem proposals?
Sorry, Sam, yeah, could you just ask the question again?
Yes,
I think
sure.
I got it. Yeah.
Sure. So what's Ofgem proposing in terms of consumer protection, and how can the collection of data help with that, and also supporting those potentially slightly more vulnerable customers that you'd see as a priority for providing heat if something was to go wrong?
Yeah, so from a consumer protection perspective, in the consultation, there's two main areas they're interested in that relate to data protection: the consumer transparency and priority services registers. So from a transparency perspective, again, we're talking specifically about use of consumption data for things like metering and billing and possible sharing with third parties. They want that to be as transparent as possible for energy consumers. That is one reason, as well as to collect more granular data of moving to what they call AMI smart meters. So they've alluded to the code of practice that Ofgem already have around being transparent to consumers and making sure that consumers are aware in plain and terrible language about pricing and consumption, and the standards that they look to be setting are not going to be as detailed as what's in electricity and gas. They don't require IHDs in home devices to be provided with smart meters, and there's options for a discussion for a consumer dashboard or consumer portal to become as one suggested method, so an online portal, for example, of providing consumers with information about how they're using heat. But it doesn't look to be something that's been mandated or proposed to be mandated initially. Around priority services registers, I mean, there's lots to talk about, but essentially, they often are proposing to make mandatory PSRs for heat network operators. This was influenced by a Citizens Advice report that showed that only about 50% of heat network operators, including those within part of the heat trust, are providing providing or maintaining priority services registers, and the key, they often want to see them a much higher rate, particularly to allow tailored communications and continuity of supply to vulnerable individuals, and potentially will go down the road of helping provide guidance to identify what vulnerability is, because in electricity and gas we've seen vast types of data being collected from customers, and various standards of what vulnerability constitutes, which has caused differing levels across the industry, and is one thing that hopefully will be more homogeneous in heat network industry.
Yeah, definitely need for consistency in the way that data is captured and the parameters. So I'm going to move on. So we've talked quite a lot about some of the challenges. We now want to look at some of the solutions to those challenges. So the first one that I'd quite like to talk about is heat network infrastructure, and what sort of controls can be applied to address some of the threats from a cybersecurity perspective. We've talked a bit about the planning stage and identifying risks, but Damon, is there anything else you wanted to add in terms of best practice from a infrastructure perspective?
Yeah, and I think when we're talking about infrastructure as well, I mean, we are talking about cybersecurity. So whilst there is obviously a heat network infrastructure that goes alongside, the provision of heat and various systems, when we're specifically talking about cybersecurity infrastructure, we're talking about those systems and computer networks that make up those systems. And I we did touch on it in terms of the identify stage, so those core assets and what you put in place. And in terms of heat networks, we have got those control systems that are paramount to actually controlling heat through these networks. Historically, we've seen attacks on these going back 10 or more years. We saw the Stuxnet worm that you might remember. There was a believed to be a state actor taking part in exploiting what we call a zero-day vulnerability, so basically an unknown vulnerability in computer systems to attack control system SCADA's control systems. I think it's particularly aimed at the likes of Iran and their nuclear program at the time. So there are clearly have been, and we continue to see attacks on control systems themselves. And if you can instigate such an attack, that could clearly have a devastating impact on your networks, particularly around heat networks, obviously. And then looking, I guess, a bit more longer term, as we start to modernize the heat networks, we talked a little about making them smart, bringing smarter devices into them, as we see more and more in electricity and gas now. So clearly there's going to be IoT devices. These can either be things controlling heat networks, so sensors for pressure, rhythms and flows and temperatures and so on, but also smart devices in the home as well. So there really is a requirement around ensuring those devices are protected. So are these devices certified to a certain standard? Are we procuring, or is there part of our procurement strategy to make sure that we're only procuring devices that are assured to a certain standard, and what should that standard be? I think these are things that are going to be determined as we move forwards in this space, as they have been in energy and gas, electricity and gas. And then finally, I guess it's the other side of that is we talked about billing, customer billing and so on. So there's the supplier side of things, how we hold customer data, how we make that available to our customers. I think someone on the chat mentioned an attack ISTA on the German energy provider. So that was, I think, something that took down their website. So that one attacked the availability of the service to the customer, that they couldn't access the website. Oh, apparently not the website. Sorry, I thought it was, but it took out their systems as I understand it. So shut down every single server. There you go. So catastrophic attack on that particular provider. So obviously not the right controls in place. Hadn't done the right assurances and assessments to make sure they did. 3 months to recover. Fantastic. Sounds like they didn't have a disaster recovery in place either. So ransomware, how do they attack? That talks to things like one of the attack vectors, which quite commonly is that social attack vector, right? So it's people, it's the staff. Have they had the right training to identify these attacks? Are they providing information they shouldn't be that's enabling these attacks? Ransomware, it's encrypting our hard drives. It's we can no longer access that information. How do we get it back? All these good things. So yeah, that covers it, Sam.
Great, thank you. Moving on to consumer protection and transparency. Think maybe a question for you, Casey, and then maybe Kaveh to come in. What sort of things can be done to satisfy consumer transparency and ensuring that the consumers really understand how their data is being used, and I guess the benefits of sharing that information?
Yeah. One of the big challenges that was identified by the CMA when they were looking into heat networks, it was originally a CMA recommendation around regulation that led to this conversation about off-gem coming in. And back then, they identified this issue that the information that was being shared with either existing customers or prospective customers on heat networks was not sufficient. They didn't understand what they were getting when they were letting a flat or buying a flat, or sometimes they wouldn't know for months after they'd moved in that boiler-shaped box on the wall was not a boiler. It was not burning gas. It was a heat interface unit taking thermal energy off a heat network. So we're starting from a position where people don't yet know enough about these systems that actually are a key plank of decarbonization. So we're starting from a place of unfamiliarity. It's not just about sharing information, like how much information should be shared. It's like there's this whole foundation of what are these things and how should they work that are necessary. Where you've got more familiar, better educated, maybe you could call them more sophisticated customers in established markets, then there's all kinds of possibilities for their participation in the system, right? So you can structure, for example, your tariffs in a way that incentivizes good behavior. One of the things that you don't want to do is pump a bunch of water unnecessarily around a heat network when it's not actually delivering thermal energy to your end customer. So you can create a tariff that has a volume component where if a whole lot of water flowed through their heat interface unit to provide just a little bit of energy, well, that has a big cost. Not all kilowatt hours of heat are created equal under that kind of a tariff, but it incentivizes the customer to behave well. Okay, but what if they don't understand, right? What if they understand, but they don't know what action to take, or they don't have the resources to call on in order to improve the performance of their system? Well, then it's useless. So there's this whole level of kind of consumer education that's necessary. And then the sharing of information on top of that. How deep does that information go? Well, the kind of data that flows out of these systems can be overwhelming. It's super detailed. And sometimes the operators are struggling to make best use of their data. Never mind the customers, the non-technical people who may be customers on that scheme. So transparency, fundamentally important. It has to be done in a way that makes sense to the resident, and it has to be shared in a way where they're not powerless. They can actually call on resources in order to improve their situation. Just read-only information with no possibility of taking action is no good. There has to be a behavioral or technical component to it. So in this context, this idea of more transparency equals better is too simple. It's about the type and the quality of information that's being shared. Transparency is fundamentally important, but the right information has to be shared with customers in the right way.
Right. Yeah, definitely agree. Kaveh, did you want to come in at all on that point, or shall I move on to third-party data sharing?
I think on transparency, I think Casey's covered everything. I think just the other element of consumer protection that isn't really addressed, but it was something that we touched on earlier, is about if to what extent is there going to be the legal basis and consent addressed in future standards or future codes issued by Ofgem in this area. If the reason is because we can see in electricity and gas for data sharing and data collection and sharing that isn't needed for the core purposes of if I use terminology from electricity and gas, a supplier or an operator, is generally needs consent. So anything for consumer apps or profiling or even using third parties that aren't in the energy industry generally does need consent. We're way off that happening at a big scale in heat networks. Even water, where there's more than 1 million smart water meters released, doesn't have a framework like that, and they're just relying on GDPR. But to use Casey's analogies of the Denmark or the Germany model, it's yet to be seen what model that the Ofgem proposes. If it is something as strict as electricity and gas, and this consent unless needed for performance, legal obligation, or contract, or if it's going to be a more an opt-out approach. For example, there could be that consumers are made aware, but they don't have to consent to use of data. They're allowed to opt out. I think on top of transparency, the consent element is something that remains to be seen to what extent it's mandated for using for consumption data and other consumers' personal data.
Yeah, I think it's quite clear from the conversation today that things are changing, and it's definitely an area that if you're involved in heat networks, you need to keep an eye on, because things might change over the next few years, and assumptions that you've made today may not be applicable in the future as things evolve.
Definitely.
Great. So just moving on to the last point on here, which is around third-party data sharing. We've talked about some of the needs to share data with third parties, but not really about how this information is shared. And I wondered, Damien, whether there's anything that you could suggest in terms of best practice from a data sharing perspective, and then perhaps I'll come to Casey to talk a bit about what they do from a guru perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Kaveh is probably a better expert on terms of sharing data, particularly personal data, but in terms of cybersecurity and the tools we got available in our kit bag for addressing the issue of data sharing, then we always rely on the triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability when we're building a framework for securing computer systems. So confidentiality really concerned with ensuring only the right people can access the data, right? Only authorized users can. And we can use tools such as protecting that data, put security controls in place. We can encrypt that data to make sure only authorized people can get hold of it. Integrity is around guaranteeing the accuracy. So if you're sharing data, how can we ensure that when it goes from one place to the other, or even internally, that it's of the right quality, it hasn't been in some way manipulated or changed. So again, we can secure those transportation links. So if you're sharing data server to server, you're doing it via secure server. I did notice on the chat someone talked about the FTP server being compromised. And if they're using a vanilla FTP server, then there's no encryption by standard of FTP unless using FTPS to secure that. And then how well secured is it? And then finally, the availability. Again, we talked about hundreds to thousands of servers being taken down in the particular example we had, becoming unavailable. So how do we ensure availability of those? Well, this sounds like a catastrophic event. So that would have been, they didn't have the right controls in place. But things they could have considered is putting the right controls in place, having redundancy of computers. That wouldn't have solved their problem. I don't think. It sounds like a catastrophic attack. So just having redundant servers would have just meant more servers would have been taken down. But they certainly could have built resilience into those servers to make sure that they were available by preventing this attack, however, whatever the attack vector was in that case. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Damien. Yeah, Casey, from your perspective, what are the sort of best practice guidelines that you follow in terms of sharing data with third parties?
As far as best practice goes, I mean, Damien's better placed, I think, and I would definitely back up his answer. But one thing I would highlight is going back to that theme of variation in the heat network market. There's a mix of new and old. There are some new organizations who are sort of cloud by default and using recognizably modern tools. And we've got a bunch of players who have been doing this for the last 15 or 20 years and are relying on some pretty creaky old systems. And you have to, in some cases, you are the glue between different parts of this utility infrastructure. We've got in heat networks, we don't have some of the infrastructure, the centralizing infrastructure that you find in electricity and gas. So in the electricity market, for example, you would have the DCC as the sort of the data clearinghouse, right? The backhaul networks between sites and the DCC would be allocated, right? You would have an operator for a territory that's recovering that data back into the DCC, and then it's going out to the consumers of that data. We don't have that in the heat network space. So the place, the Guru Systems where I work, we are effectively a DCC for all those sites that we're connected to. And some of the other players in the market who do a similar job to us are also their own DCC. So that makes it harder because there is more surface, there is more attack surface, and it means that everybody has got to toe the line. So those are the two ingredients that make it hard. One, pretty much everybody's implementing everything. And two, there's a big variation between the new players and the old players and everything in between, such that when you are trying to glue these different pieces of the utility infrastructure together, there may be weak links in the chain. There almost certainly will be.
Great, thank you all. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see all the questions that have been coming through. Thank you all for the chat that's been going on whilst we've been speaking. It's been interesting to sort of read some of the commentary. In terms of questions, see if there's anything specific. Miles, did you have a question? You responded to my comment about questions.
Yeah, I did. Can you hear me, Sam?
Yes, perfect.
Great. Yeah, so I had a question on if anything had come up either via Ofgem or Gov about a DCC concept for the industry, because I think I 100% agree with Casey that that data is so important. And one of the biggest challenges we have, and I had when I worked at an energy or a heat supplier, was that the data is just spread across so many different systems. You got a type of smart meter there, Alvaco gateways there, a BMS here, and we spend a lot of money with all these integrations. And there were some sites which we just couldn't work on because we weren't integrated with them. So what we're doing now is trying to create this sort of hub concept. And I was wondering if there was anything that was sort of mandated from Ofgem coming down to say, hey, actually, we're going to have a hub, which is a central place where you can go and fetch the data with all the right contracts, yeah, et cetera, in place.
If anybody wants to jump in, Cutway.
I mean, it's probably one for Casey, but so Miles, just from my knowledge, neither from a network perspective nor from a hub perspective, I have don't think I've seen anything being proposed or discussed for the heat industry or heat networks, just because of how disparate the systems and the fact that it's not all joined up into one network would make that very difficult. But Casey, I don't know if you've got any other thoughts.
I can try. Hey, Miles.
Hi, how's Casey?
So I think that the sheer number of players in the space, just the 14,000 plus heat network operators in our space, means that the kind of standardization that you can impose on the electricity market is going to be really hard. You've got Ofgem picking up a market that is big enough to be unwieldy, with a huge variety of players in it. And I suspect the route they're going to have to go is defining some of the rules of interoperation, as opposed to getting to the point of mandating some kind of central DCC.
Right,
so that
right.
means that, you know, the folks who are in the market handling data, like you or like us, like I suspect that all of us will have to be towing the line on certain standards, but I can't see them imposing some kind of, I could be wrong, right? This is my personal view.
Right.
But I think given the amount of catch up that they're having to play right now, that will not be on their minds for quite some time.
Right.
That's it.
Okay.
We're so far behind in the heat network space. You know, we're only just getting to the point of regulating the market, and that's going to take a while to come to fruition. So, yeah, I think never say never, because it may come down the line. But yeah, I'd agree.
Okay.
I've not heard anything.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I suppose maybe we see an open data concept where you're encouraged to share stuff in a safe way.
Yeah.
Cool.
Marco, you have provided some fantastic insight in the chat. Did you have any specific thoughts you wanted to share?
If I may, I'm
Yeah,
kind of in agreement with Casey there that this is a spaghetti. You don't want to get Ofgem won't want to get ketchup on the shirt. There is a difference between a heat meter and data collection infrastructure. There is a difference between a heat meter and a prepayment device. And where the UK differs from the continent, on the continent, prepayment is a criminal offence in most jurisdictions for heat. You're not allowed to cut people off. So the meter, the regulated part, just measures, just sends the data, and then you send the bill to the apartment owner. In the UK, we have the prepayment systems. So you now have two devices. In the electricity gas space, they're combined into one box. In the heat space, they're two separate boxes. You're not going to persuade the market to put the prepayment devices everywhere, nor are you going to persuade people who currently use prepayment devices that they don't want to make people prepay, because there was a good reason they put these devices in the first place. You're also going to see more, not prepayment devices, but probably smart HIUs, smart interfaces being used to read meters. So I completely agree. There won't be a standardized infrastructure. What they will probably mandate, at the moment, there are some players in this space that say we operate open hardware. So open metering systems, a classic example. This is the box. Anybody can use it. You buy it, you own it, you set it up. There's the open API players, like Guru, for example. This is the Guru system. Anybody can operate this system if they integrate with our API, but you integrate a bit like a SMETS1 device at server level. And there's 10 different flavors of prepayment system. This is 10 different SMETS1 devices. This is pretty good. Where the regulation is probably going to come in, there are some players who refuse to provide API access at server level to this either the meter reading infrastructure or the prepayment infrastructure, and that is probably going to be outlawed. That if you want to be going forward, if the equipment is going in, it must be available to use to any operator on equal commercial terms with any other operator, and you'll effectively end up with a mix of SMETS1 and SMETS2 devices, kind of the same as you have in the electricity and gas space. That was our thoughts. But if you're not in the prepayment space, this is already a solved problem from the continent. You can copy paste it, and there's a link in the chat that the specialist part is where you start using HIUs, smart heat pumps or prepayment systems to collect the data, and that's where we'll have to regulate carefully.
Thanks, Margaret. That's really interesting.
Are there any other questions or comments? I know we're slightly over time, but happy to stay on if there are any more discussions. It's really useful to get people's insights.
Money, if I may.
Yeah, on you go, Mark.
So you can be a nuisance. If you want to be a nuisance on a heat network, there's a chap who has a classic Saab down in Hackney, and he is banned from parking at a specific parking space because the exhaust gas goes into the boiler room and trips the carbon monoxide sensor and shuts down the whole heat network. If you want to be a nuisance, you kick the door down and flip the power switch. Physical security. If you are an idiot, you'd be like ISTA, Germany, and you'd put all of your systems on the same network and say, as long as the door's locked, it's fine. The minute somebody goes into one plant room, they can shut down all of them because they're all on the same network. There is an ESCO in the United Kingdom who does this. So there is a large multinational utility company who has all of their boiler rooms on the same company corporate network, and if you get into any one of them, you could shut down the lot. This is pretty dumb, and this should probably be a focus because that'll be BBC News. The metering infrastructure is pretty boring. It is personal data, but it's not exciting enough or valuable enough on the open market to warrant the effort to hack it. The bit that people are interested in is, I want your money and I want all your passwords. So the reason that the North Koreans went after ISTA is because when you ask somebody to register for an account, they'll give username, email, date of birth, password, and they'll probably give the same secret question answers as they do everywhere else. So what is your pet's first name, Bob? What is your mother's maiden name, Sarah? That will be the same everywhere. If you nick it from the billing bureau, you can then go and steal their real money or compromise their eBay accounts and use them for selling stuff. So that's the interesting
I think
stuff.
that really emphasizes that even if on the face of it, the information that's being collected isn't that interesting to somebody that might look to hack, there's a lot of other personal information that you'd be collecting that could be.
And it's the billing bureaus that are the operators in the billing bureaus general purpose corporate IT that is the juicy part for attacking. Now you might get into that via poor data collection infrastructure, but the valuable on the open black market part is money data. And that related to that, there are two ways of collecting money. If I had the bank of Samantha and Damien was the customer and Casey was the client, Damien could give Samantha the money and then Samantha could give it to Casey. And now I want to go after Samantha because she's got all the client monies in her account. Or Samantha could say, tell you what, when Damien clicks the button, the money goes straight from Damien to Casey without ever going through your account. So one is acting as agent and one is handling client monies. So one is very dangerous, one is less dangerous. So there should probably be different tiers of regulation. And this is where the FCA comes in. Are you handling client monies? You are going to be subject to an awful lot more scrutiny. There should be a tick box for operators to say, are you going to touch client money? Yes. Okay. Level 9 of auditing and obligations. Are you just transferring money from A to B using a recognized like Go Cardless, Stripe, these professional outfits? Okay, then lesser degree of scrutiny perhaps. So
I think we might see a slightly varied approach depending on the individual.
It require less regulation by doing less. If you volunteer to use professional services for stuff instead of trying to DIY it, you could reduce your risk and need less regulation. The final one's a bit more mischief. There are some, meters. One of the biggest headaches is validating that the data you've received actually came from the meter that you think it did. And there's all sorts of.
That's an interesting point. Not something that's not come up so far.
So there's admin errors. Like contractors, plumbers are useless at writing down which meter in which apartment. They're forever writing down the wrong serial number. So is the gas and electricity industry liable to the same mistakes. The meter for number 12 is actually registered at 13 and vice versa. But you can also fiddle with meters to give them a different name. Tonight, Matthew, I'm going to be Dave. And that is entirely possible using the infrastructure that most UK operators are currently deploying, because they're deploying state-of-the-art wired MBUS stuff, which you can manipulate with ease in this respect. there's also a lot of really clanky legacy gateways in place where they take the metadata, interpret it, and then send just a subset of that interpretation onto the final person, and you have no way of guaranteeing that this is actually what this came from here using these legacy stuffs. Elsewhere, you've got a meter with an encryption key. It has an encrypted packet, which is generated by that meter, and that key, you can send it however you like. It doesn't really matter. It gets here, and only here do you decrypt it. And once you decrypt it, you know damn well it came from only that particular meter. So there's
definitely worth bearing in mind. Yeah.
That area of an audit trail. So I think the bit in the middle is not very interesting if you get it right. It's the audit trail for meter specific stuff, and then the money that the hackers want to, money and personal data the hackers want to get after should probably be more of a focus, because that'll be more of a BBC story with good reason than, you know, I looked at when Mrs. Miggins wakes up and has a shower. That's not very not so interesting. Sorry,
Thanks,
I'll get off the soapbox now.
No, all interesting stuff. We're quite a bit over time. I can see people are needing to drop off. So just leave me to say thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you found it useful, took away some snippets that will help you in your day-to-day. If you do have any questions, want to talk to any of our speakers, we'll pop our email addresses in the chat, so feel free to reach out. Thank you all so much.